My name is Daphne Mitchell. I'm 33 years old and I live in Austin, Texas. My father was buried yesterday morning. And this afternoon my husband, Travis, sat in my father's office, leaning back in his chair like a king, looked at me without hesitation and said, "From now on I'll be running the company. You just need to stay quiet and sign." I stood there, surrounded by shelves that still carried my father's scent, my hand gripping the divorce papers Travis had thrown on the desk like some kind of transaction. The man I had sacrificed my youth for was quietly tearing apart everything my father built. Have you ever been betrayed by your own family at the very moment you were at your weakest? If you've ever been pushed out of your own life by someone who kept calling themselves family, leave a comment below, hit like and subscribe to this channel. Because what I'm about to share next is something you won't believe. 10 years ago I had just graduated college with a degree in business, full of dreams of joining my father and helping Mitchell sons grow even stronger. But life doesn't always unfold the way we hope. That summer, my father sat out back on the porch holding a cup of lukewarm coffee, his eyes staring thoughtfully at the sun-scorched lawn. I walked over, gently placed my hand on his shoulder. He turned to me, his smile more crooked than usual. "Daphne, the company might not survive much longer," he whispered, his voice strained. I sat beside him, my heart tightening. The company was his lifeblood. He built it with his bare hands from a tiny shop with only 3 workers. It was where I grew up, watching every window frame assembled with sweat, where I saw my father stay up through the night fixing broken blueprints. "I'll help you, Dad. We'll figure it out," I said, though I had no idea where to start. He stayed quiet. Then he pulled a business card from his shirt pocket and handed it to me. "Gerald Morgan. Morgan Estates Group." I read the name on the card and a cold feeling swept through me. He agreed to invest. "But there's a condition." I looked up at my father. His face had gone pale. "You have to marry his son, Travis." My heart pounded in my chest. Travis Morgan. I had seen him twice at industry events. Tall, handsome, with the kind of smile that said he never took anything seriously. I'd heard he dropped out of college to start a fashion company and blew through the entire investment in 6 months. People called him the man who lived off the Morgan name. "You don't have to agree right away," my father continued, staring down at his hands. "If there were another way, I'd take it. But right now, this is the only way. Gerald will transfer the funds the day the marriage contract is signed." I fell silent. I never thought my life would become a bargaining chip in someone else's negotiation. That night I didn't sleep. I walked the neighborhood thinking about the factory workers who didn't know whether they'd still have jobs tomorrow. I thought about my mother, who passed away when I was 18, who always protected my father at all costs. And I thought about him, the way he treated his workers like family. 3 days later, I signed the marriage contract with Travis Morgan. The wedding was held at a private resort by Lake Travis. Yes, the same name as my husband. Under the sunset, I walked down the aisle with a man I barely knew beyond rumors. Everyone smiled. Everyone except me. On our wedding night, Travis sat in a chair, pouring red wine into a crystal glass, lounging like it was his birthday party rather than a marriage. "Did you ever dream about your perfect wedding?" he asked, raising an eyebrow mockingly. I didn't answer. He shrugged, downed his wine and said casually, "Me neither. But hey, for money, for the company, for so-called family duty, I figured why not just go with it." I looked at him. He was charming, attractive, but there was something hollow behind his eyes that frightened me. In the early months after the wedding, we lived like strangers under the same roof. Travis was rarely home. When he was glued to his phone or surrounded by friends throwing loud parties. I spent my days working with my father, learning every part of the business, quietly taking notes, absorbing what no textbook could teach. Each night I came home to a house too large, too quiet, feeling like a tenant trapped in a contract. And that's how I lived, 8 years as a shadow. No one asked if I was happy. No one noticed when I stopped showing up at the lavish Morgan parties. I quietly built something of my own, a nonprofit supporting women who were financially manipulated. Someone once said to me, "You're so sharp, why not become a CO?" I just smiled. I was Frank Mitchell's daughter. I didn't need a title to prove my worth. But deep down, I always hoped that one day he would trust me enough to hand over the one thing he poured his life into, his company. And I used to believe that if I waited long enough, it would come. I was wrong. Or maybe I never truly understood the cost of making deals bound by power and pretense. And that cost was betrayal waiting just around the corner. My marriage to Travis was like a beautifully framed window. Perfect on the outside, shattered inside. At first, I thought it was just a phase. That he'd change or at least preserve a shred of decency now that I was his wife. But year after year, that hope withered, like a potted plant forgotten on a sun-baked porch. Travis stopped even pretending. He spent money like the bank account had no bottom, constantly buying expensive things we didn't need. One month, I discovered his wine and cigar bills exceeded the combined salary of 5 of my father's employees. But what hurt most wasn't the money. It was the way he used it to paint a flashy fake life where I was never included. At every party or industry event, Travis would show up with a smug smile and a new companion. They were always called PR partners, creative friends, or image consultants, but everyone knew what they were. I was only mentioned in interviews as a polished, well-educated wife. The moral accessory for the Morgan brand. One evening, during a fundraiser for rural education, I stood quietly near the guest table, watching Travis laugh intimately with a blonde in a fire-red dress, standing out like fireworks in a beige ballroom. A guest leaned over and whispered to me, "Daphne, who is she?" "You're Travis's wife, aren't you?" I smiled softly, keeping my shoulders from shaking. "Probably his PR assistant." "That's strange, she looks close." I quietly stepped outside, standing alone under the golden lights hanging from the hotel awning. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't even sad. I just felt like I was living someone else's life. A life written by a contract, bound by misguided loyalty to my father, and the naive belief that sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. It was in that emptiness that I began to breathe again. It started with an email from an old friend named Lillian, who worked for a nonprofit that supported women transitioning after divorce or financial abuse. She asked if I'd be interested in sponsoring a panel discussion. I agreed. And when I stood on stage for the first time speaking about my own experience, a loveless marriage, subtle financial isolation, being cut out of every major decision, I saw dozens of eyes staring back at me with empathy. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from sorrow, but because something inside me had been reignited. I started asking myself, if I could reach those women just by telling the truth, then why couldn't I do more? I decided to start a small organization called the Lawn On Foundation, named after my mother, a woman who sacrificed quietly just like I once did. Its mission was to provide legal support, financial counseling, and a safe space for women experiencing financial abuse or asset control in marriage. I used part of the inheritance my mother left me, along with a personal loan from a close friend, Amy, who would later become the attorney by my side in the biggest fight of my life. In those early days, it was just me, a part-time assistant, and a rented office in the basement of an abandoned church. But I had never felt more alive. I learned how to build a budget, organize events, speak with donors, and even clean the space when needed. In the mornings, I still worked at my father's company, learning operations and meeting with partners. In the afternoons, I focused on my foundation. At night, I took online business management courses through the University of Pennsylvania. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need validation. I did it for myself. One day, at a community center workshop, I met a woman named Marie. Her voice trembled as she described how her husband kept all the credit cards, forbade her from working, monitored every medical bill, and blamed her for being difficult. When Marie asked me how someone could start over from nothing, I looked her in the eye and said, "First, you have to believe you have the right to control your own life. After that, we'll find a way." That night when I got home, Travis was passed out on the sofa, still drunk. On the table were 2 wine glasses and a pink silk scarf draped over the armrest. I didn't need to ask whose it was. I just looked at him and walked upstairs. For the first time, I didn't feel weak or humiliated. I just felt like he no longer mattered in my life. And from that moment on, I knew I was no longer a shadow. I was stepping into the light one step at a time, and the world would have to learn to see me for who I truly am. My father passed away on a crisp October morning. The sky was clear, but the air was unnervingly cold. I still remember the vibration of my phone in my coat pocket, the nurse's short words echoing through the speaker. "We did everything we could." Frank Mitchell passed peacefully. I sat motionless in the car, parked outside the hospital gate. The wind pressed against the windows like a long, endless sigh. A part of me had known this day would come, but not so soon. Not before I could say goodbye. Not before I was strong enough to keep my promise to him, to stand on my own, to reclaim the place I deserved in the company and in life. My father's funeral was simple, just like the way he lived. No extravagance, no display. Only those who truly cared about him. Former colleagues, a few loyal partners, and the workers who had been with him since Mitchell Sons was founded. I stood by the grave, staring at the cold stone, my heart unbearably heavy. Travis showed up nearly half an hour late, wearing a wrinkled moss-green suit, eyes still bearing the faint shadows of the night before. He placed a crumpled flower wreath and stood beside me without saying a word. I thought at the very least that day he would show basic respect for the deceased. I was wrong. Less than 48 hours later, in an emergency executive meeting that Travis himself had called, he stood in the large boardroom, yellow lights casting sharp angles across his smug face, and spoke loudly and clearly. Starting today, as per the legally signed and notarized will, I, Travis Morgan, will assume the position of Chief Executive Officer of Mitchell Sons. The room fell silent for a few seconds before whispers erupted. I could barely believe what I was hearing. Sitting just a few feet away from him, I turned toward him, locking eyes. "What did you just say?" My voice came out dry like desert wind. Travis smiled politely, eyes glittering with triumph. "I was clear, Daphne. Your father's will explicitly states that the CEO position and full executive control are to be passed on to his legal heir, the lawful husband of his daughter, which is me." I shot up from my chair. "That's impossible. My father never. He told me if I ever had the courage to leave this marriage, he would leave the company to me. He never intended for you to take over." Travis pulled a thick stack of laminated papers from his briefcase. He handed them to the company's legal advisor, Mr. Raymond Fisher, who had worked with my father for nearly 2 decades. Fisher flipped through the pages, then gave a heavy nod. "The signature is authentic. Notarized 3 weeks ago. It has a valid registration code and is filed with the local office." It felt like I was falling into a bottomless pit. I barely kept myself from collapsing back into the chair. 3 weeks ago, that was when my father was first hospitalized with breathing problems. I had been at his bedside almost daily. Why hadn't he said anything? Why would he change the will? Travis remained upright, hands clasped, wearing the calm expression of someone announcing a new sales campaign. "I understand this may come as a surprise to some of you, but I'm here to ensure the company continues to grow. We need a new direction, someone bold enough to lead. And I believe I have that vision." I said nothing more. As the others resumed their discussion, I quietly left the room, haunted by one burning question. What really happened in my father's final days? That evening, I sat in my father's old office, the room still faintly smelling of linseed oil and his favorite tobacco. I opened the bottom drawer, the one he used to store handwritten plans and personal notes. But it was empty. I turned to the filing cabinet, opening each drawer. Nothing unusual. No alternate will, no draft of a transition plan, nothing to suggest he had once intended to pass the company on to me. I leaned back in his chair, a chill creeping up my spine. Everything was too neat. Too clean. Too deliberate. What had Travis done? Who helped him? And if my father truly did change the will, under what circumstances? Was he coerced? Deceived while he was growing weaker each day? A sudden thought struck me. I picked up my phone and called an old friend, Amy Russell, the attorney who had helped me register my nonprofit. When she answered, my voice was almost trembling. "Amy, I need you to look into a will. Something's not right." "Not at all." Amy didn't take long to uncover the anomaly. For days after that late-night call, she met me at a small cafe in East Austin. She arrived 10 minutes early as always and chose a quiet table in the corner. When I walked in, Amy had already closed her laptop, her eyes sharp behind her brown-rimmed glasses. "Sit down, Daphne. We've got a serious problem, but there's a glimmer of hope." I pulled out the chair, hands still slightly shaking. "Tell me." Amy opened her bag, pulled out a neatly clipped stack of documents and placed it on the table. I cross-checked the local notary's records with the code from the will Travis submitted. There is a document on file, notarized 3 weeks before Mr. Frank passed. But, she paused, her tone slowing. When I dug deeper through the law firm your dad used for years, I found this. She flipped the first page. The will stored at Hank Morris's firm, your father's personal legal counsel for nearly 15 years, has never been revoked or replaced. And the contents of that will are completely different from the one Travis presented. I held my breath. Amy nodded slightly. In the original, Mr. Frank explicitly names you as the sole heir to the company's shares, executive authority, and all related assets. Not Travis. And he also included a handwritten letter, archived alongside the original document as a final personal message. I stared at my friend, unable to speak. It felt like someone had cracked open a sealed door in my chest. So, if the real one was never replaced, then what exactly did Travis submit to the board? Amy leaned forward, her voice low. A forged document. Forged signature, forged seal. Everything was crafted with precision. It looked real. But I verified it. The notary listed Peter Lowell is a real person. But he swears he never met your father, never notarized any will for him in the past 3 years. I froze. Travis definitely colluded with someone or manipulated someone on the inside to stage this entire setup. If Hank Morris still has the real will, we still have a chance. But there's something else. Amy hesitated. Hank retired 2 years ago. He's been living off the grid in the western mountains of Colorado, near a small town called Glen Haven. I managed to reach him through an old email address. But he's cautious. He wants to meet in person. I clenched my hands under the table. I'll go. Amy looked up. The earliest flight is tomorrow morning. I booked a seat for you. There's a car waiting to take you from Denver Airport to Glen Haven. But Daphne, she paused, her eyes filled with real concern. You need to be ready. If Travis was bold enough to fake a will, he may not stop there. You have to be careful. I nodded, a quiet fire burning in my chest. For years I had lived in silence, endured everything, avoided confrontation. But now I couldn't stand by and watch that man steal my father's legacy, his life's work, and everything he built. The next afternoon I landed at Denver Airport with little more than a small suitcase and a leather satchel filled with the documents Amy had prepared. It took nearly 3 hours to drive to Glen Haven, winding through mountain roads lined with evergreens and dusted with early snow. By evening I stood before a small wooden cabin tucked into the hillside. The front door was dark-stained, the roof low, and soft golden light flickered through frosted glass. I knocked. A moment later the door creaked open. A tall, lean man with silver hair and piercing eyes stepped out. I'm Daphne Mitchell, I said quietly. Frank's daughter. Hank Morris looked at me for a long moment as if weighing every breath. Then he opened the door wider. Come in. We have a lot to talk about. Inside the cabin was surprisingly warm. Dark pine walls, a crackling fireplace, and the faint scent of peppermint tea filled the air. He poured me a cup, then silently pulled a green file folder from a small safe behind the bookshelf. This will, he said slowly, was signed right here for days before he went to the hospital. He came alone, unannounced. Sat here for 3 hours. After signing, he handed me a letter, asked me to hold it, and said I was to give it only to you, when the time came. I held the folder, feeling its weight like stone in my hands. Hank watched me, then said, Frank loved you more than anything. But he also knew, you'd only truly stand tall if you had a reason to rise. Maybe this is that moment. I didn't respond. I simply opened the will, reading every line as if carving it into my bones. And when I saw the name, Daphne and Mitchell, sole heir, something inside me shifted. It wasn't vengeance. It was the return of something I'd lost long ago, belief in myself. I sat on a wooden chair by the fire, the will spread out before me, my hands still trembling slightly. Hank had gone into the kitchen, giving me a few minutes of privacy, as if he instinctively knew I needed time to absorb it all. The will was handwritten, my father's penmanship still firm, even, and precise, just like the notes he used to leave on old design blueprints. No complex clauses. No legal theatrics. Just a clear, unambiguous message. All shares, control, and assets of Mitchell Sons belonged to me. Tucked at the end of the file was a letter. I picked it up and opened it gently. The black ink flowed in a familiar slant, and the paper still held the faint warmth of my father's presence, like a scent memory refusing to fade. My daughter. If you're reading this letter, It means I didn't get to say what I always hoped to tell you in person. I'm sorry for not protecting you from a marriage you should never have had to endure. I watched you stay silent, preserving peace for others, sacrificing so much that you lost sight of your own dreams. I'm not leaving the company to you as a gift. I'm giving it to you because you earned it. Because no one understands the value of every brick in that place more than you. Daphne, if the time comes that you must stand alone, do it with pride. You don't need permission to exist, to lead, to thrive. Live a life where you never apologize for being strong. With love, Dad. I folded the letter, my eyes blurred but my heart clearer than it had been in years. Some words only reach us after a person is gone. And some strength only awakens when we're truly alone. When Hank returned, I stood up. I want to move forward. I'll go through proper legal channels. No rushing, no recklessness. But I need your help to prepare. He nodded, pulling a USB drive from the folder. Your father had me scan the original documents and record the signing session. I have photos, witnesses. You'll need all of it for court. I took it. Where do I start? First, signature verification. I've already sent copies to the handwriting analysis office in Austin, but it'll take at least 3 weeks. They need to compare samples, verify notarization, and check with relevant parties. 3 weeks. I went still. In 3 weeks, Travis could do anything. Sell shares, transfer assets, cut key staff, even tamper with numbers to erase all traces of my father. I knew how he operated. When cornered, Travis wouldn't surrender, he'd sabotage. What can I do while we wait? I asked, my voice steadier. Hank handed me another packet, a step-by-step guide to filing an emergency petition with Travis County Court, requesting temporary preservation of estate, including freezing accounts and blocking the sale of company assets before the will is verified. You'll need a court-authorized legal representative, he said. I've already sent the files to Amy. She has a license to practice in Texas. If the court agrees, they'll issue an injunction within 7 days. I nodded, committing every detail to memory. We spent the rest of the evening organizing the documents, checking signatures, notary stamps, witness statements, and the audio recording of my father's signing session. By the time I left Hank's house the next morning, I carried not only a crucial legal file, but a renewed belief in myself. On the flight back to Austin, I sat by the window, dawn pouring through and casting a golden hue on my father's letter in my coat pocket. I took out my phone and sent Amy a short text. Hold the line. I'm bringing the truth. As the plane began its descent, rooftops blurred beneath the morning mist. Everything looked peaceful, but I knew a storm was ahead. And I was ready to walk straight into it, on my own but no longer alone. With my father's words in my heart, the law by my side, and the truth in hand, I would take back everything. Not out of gratitude, not out of obligation, but because I deserved it. Back in Austin, I went straight to Amy's office and filed the necessary documents with Travis County Court, requesting a temporary asset freeze on Mitchell's sons. We were waiting for the judge's decision. But in the meantime, Travis didn't stay idle. That evening, I received a strange message from an unknown number. Daphne, this is Luke Daniels. I worked with your father for over 10 years. I need to see you right away. This can't be said over the phone. I remembered that name. Luke had been the head accountant when my father was still in charge. Quiet, principled, and never seen at any of Travis's flashy events. We met at a small Mexican diner on the south side of town. When I arrived, he was already seated in the back corner, wearing a faded brown jacket and a baseball cap. His eyes were still sharp, just like I remembered from my intern days. Thank you for reaching out, I said, not even bothering to order a drink. What's going on? Luke didn't beat around the bush. He pulled a USB drive and a stack of printed bank statements from his briefcase. I've been monitoring Travis's financial activity since Mr. Frank passed. And I think you need to know, he's been quietly selling off the company's fixed assets. 3 heavy-duty CNC machines, 2 warehouse lots in the suburbs, and nearly all the shares in the satellite plant in Oklahoma. Everything's been legalized through intermediary shell companies. I held the papers, my heart pounding as I read the buyer's name, an offshore firm based in Nassau, Bahamas. Morgan Ridge Holdings? I repeated. Luke nodded. It's a shell company barely 2 months old, registered under a fake passport. I traced the IP address used in the transaction, and it led to an email account linked to Travis. I didn't say a word. A chill spread from my fingertips. That's not even the worst part, Luke continued, his voice dropping. I discovered Travis has been accessing confidential directories in Mr. Frank's old financial system. There's one particular investment your father kept hidden, contributions made to the Lawn On Foundation, spread over several years, masked as welfare fund disbursements from the company. I looked up. You're saying he's trying to erase proof that my father supported my organization? Not just trying, Luke said slowly. Travis hired a team of overseas hackers to break into the legacy servers and wipe the original records. If you don't have backups or witnesses, everything could disappear. I was stunned. The Lawn On Foundation wasn't just my heart's work. It was where I had helped hundreds of women. It stood as living proof that I had rebuilt my life after a forced marriage. And my father, he never spoke of it, but he had silently protected me in his own way. I need help, I said, my eyes still locked on the documents. Luke nodded. I've contacted an old friend in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. You need to work with them immediately. This is preliminary evidence. But if you want to protect everything, you'll have to act fast. The next day, I met Special Agent Emily Price at a temporary FBI field office in Central Texas. Emily was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s. After reviewing Luke's file, she didn't hide her concern. We're currently investigating a network of money laundering operations involving Caribbean shell corporations, Emily said. If what Luke's uncovered is accurate, then Travis Morgan could be a link in something much bigger. I placed a copy of the will, my father's handwritten letter, and the list of withdrawn assets on the desk. I don't care how deep he's in with these criminals. I just want to reclaim what my father left behind, and protect the people I'm responsible for. Emily nodded. We'll open a formal investigation. But we'll need time to request subpoenas and freeze international accounts. In the meantime, continue monitoring everything he does. And keep this physical evidence absolutely secure. Back home, I locked the USB drive in my personal safe, created 2 backup copies on external drives, and stored one in a bank deposit box. I no longer believed in anything being completely safe. Travis had money, connections, and the recklessness to do anything. But I had the truth. I had the law. And I had a promise to keep. From that day on, I lived like walking a tightrope, showing up to work as usual, smiling through board meetings, while quietly watching every transaction Travis made. I began recording hallway conversations, archiving internal emails, and closely observing every reaction from the finance department. There were moments I'd catch Travis staring at me from across the hallway, his eyes a mix of suspicion and smugness. Maybe he was starting to feel the heat. Maybe he still believed I'd always be the silent, obedient wife he'd controlled for years. But he had forgotten one thing. I was no longer the 23-year-old girl forced into a wedding dress for a business arrangement. I was Frank Mitchell's daughter. And I was gathering every shard of truth to bring it into the light. That day, the sky was cloudy with a crisp chill in the air, even though it was still late fall. I stood in front of the Mitchell Sons building, the place that had once been my father's dream and the very place I once told myself I'd never belong. But that morning, I didn't walk in as someone's wife or a sidelined employee. I walked in as the rightful owner of everything they were bargaining away. Amy walked beside me, sharply dressed with purpose, holding a thick legal folder. FBI agent Emily Price had already arrived with her team and a copy of the arrest warrant. Everything was ready. We just needed the right moment. The shareholders' meeting was held on the 15th floor, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Austin, a room that had seen contracts inked and legacies built. Travis stood at the podium, composed like a man stepping onto a stage. Dark gray suit, crimson tie, his signature smug grin. To his right stood a representative from Ariston Global, a foreign construction conglomerate known for buying out struggling American firms. Thank you all for coming, Travis began, his voice crisp through the microphone. Today, I'm officially announcing that we've reached a preliminary agreement with Ariston Global to transfer 100% of Mitchell Sons shares. The transaction is expected to finalize within 2 weeks. The room stirred. Some shareholders whispered among themselves. A few younger ones discreetly checked their stock apps. But I walked straight in, heels tapping softly against the marble, each step slicing through the tension in the air. Travis saw me. For a split second, I caught the flicker of panic in his eyes. He masked it quickly with a crooked smile. Daphne. Here to see me make headlines in the business section? He teased, tone laced with arrogance. I said nothing. Amy handed me the verified copy of the will and the court injunction, all bound in a black leather folder. I stepped forward and laid it on the executive table. I'm here to assert my legal right to this company as per the verified last will of Mr. Frank Mitchell, founder of Mitchell Sons. The will was executed by Mr. Hank Morris, notarized days before Mr. Frank was hospitalized and legally validated by the court 3 days ago. The room froze. Some flipped through the papers in front of them. The Ariston rep leaned back, clearly blindsided. Travis scoffed. A will? What kind of stunt is this? You think a few handwritten pages and a retired notary can override my legal authority? Amy stepped up, her voice like steel. We have the original court confirmation, digital filing with the Asset Management Bureau, and the signed audio recording. More importantly, we have an emergency injunction from the Travis County Court halting all transactional activity, including the proposed deal with Ariston. Travis's face turned pale. Right then, Agent Emily Price walked in, flashing her badge and paperwork. She spoke each word clearly. Travis Morgan, you are under arrest for money laundering, falsifying legal documents, and misappropriation of company assets for personal gain. You have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. She signaled to her colleagues. They stepped forward, gently but firmly pulling Travis's arms behind his back and securing the cuffs in one smooth motion. This is a mistake, Travis barked, his confidence unraveling. I'm the CEO. I'm just doing my job. Not anymore, I said, not loud, but loud enough for everyone to hear. The room erupted. Some were shocked. A few got up from their chairs. Then from the left side of the table, an elderly shareholder, Mr. Martin Hayes, who had stood beside my father since the company's inception, rose to his feet and began to clap slowly. Another followed. Then another. And soon the whole room stood, applause building, echoing off the walls like years of silence finally shattering. I didn't look back at Travis again. As he was led out of the room, the triumph was gone from his eyes. All that remained was panic and bitterness, directed at the very person he once thought would never rise. But I had risen. And I was coming back not just as Frank Mitchell's daughter, but as the true heir to his legacy, not by title but by strength. The first morning I stepped into the office as the legal CEO of Mitchell Sons, it was drizzling. Thin, misty rain fell steadily on the large glass window behind my father's chair, now mine. The room remained exactly as it was the day he passed. Every small item, every pen, ruler, and faded white ceramic coffee cup evoked the presence of the man who was gone. I sat down without turning on the lights. I just listened to the soft sound of rain. I didn't boot up the computer right away. Instead, I opened my father's old dark leather notebook, where he recorded meetings, production process improvements, and brief philosophies like, assets don't lie in machines but in people. I began the recovery process by reviewing all management staff. Some had been loyal to my father but pushed aside by Travis. Others silently compromised, afraid for their positions. I didn't seek revenge. I chose to keep those ready to rebuild the company with transparency and ethics. The rest I asked to leave, with transition support if needed. I held a company-wide meeting. For the first time in over a decade, the conference room was packed. I didn't stand behind the podium. Instead, I walked among them. No microphone, no PowerPoint. I'm not here to promise anything extraordinary, I said. I'm here to start over, from the very place my father once stood, among the people who believed in him, worked for him, and treated this company as part of their family. I outlined the restructuring plan, cutting unnecessary expenses, reinvesting in product quality instead of flashy marketing, prioritizing retraining long-term employees instead of layoffs. I introduced an internal women's support program, a vocational training initiative for female employees whose careers had been interrupted by childcare, domestic violence, or lack of advancement opportunities in technical roles. The following week, I worked with finance to allocate 5% of quarterly net profits to the Lawn On Foundation. No longer just a side charity, the foundation became an official social branch of Mitchell Sons, launching specific projects, building shelters for abused women, offering vocational scholarships, providing free legal aid, and establishing a statewide hotline across Texas. We chose the first site in a small town near the southern border, where financial abuse rates for women were the highest in the state. When I arrived to survey the location, a middle-aged woman named Nora hugged me tightly. She trembled as she shared her 20 years living in a home where every dollar had to be approved, every outing logged. "I never thought a window company could open a way out for me," she whispered. I couldn't hold back my tears. As for Travis, the trial began 3 months after his arrest. I didn't attend all the hearings, but I was present for sentencing. He received 12 years in prison for money laundering, falsifying financial records, and abusing management authority. Throughout the trial, he never once looked at me. Upon receiving the final verdict, I met privately with his lawyer and proposed a special clause. I wouldn't demand any compensation if Travis handed over all remaining assets to repay individuals, contractors, and small suppliers he had abandoned. Though their voices were small, they had been the silent backbone of this company. After the official divorce, I withdrew all my personal assets from the settlement and transferred them to a trust fund named Second Window. A new door for women who had been betrayed, lost, and thought they had nothing left to return to. I bear no hatred. But I believe justice is served not just by verdicts, but by the way we choose to act afterward. I still remember one morning watching young workers operate the new wood press installed at the West Workshop. They laughed as they worked, while a new female employee, Maggie, a single mother, was trained directly by a senior engineer nearing retirement. I didn't intervene, just stood there watching. But in the early morning light slanting through the windows, I saw what my father had dreamed of. A company not just building windows but opening pathways for lives. That night I stayed late in the office. Everyone else had left. The hall was so quiet I could hear the wind whispering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I brewed myself a cup of ginger tea and brought it into my father's office, now a reading and archive space for original designs, notebooks, and operational journals dating back to the company's beginnings. On the mahogany shelf behind his desk, I found the small wooden box he had kept private. Inside were familiar items: an old pocket watch, a brass paperclip shaped like an owl, and the letter he left me, its corner blurred from tears I shed nights ago. I opened the letter and read slowly once more. "You don't need a man to prove your worth. You are strong enough to save yourself and the family." I closed the letter, pressing it gently against my chest, as if holding a piece of his heart still left behind. Under the soft yellow light, I saw every wrinkle on the paper, every bold, slanted stroke filled with resolve. It wasn't just a farewell. It was the final key he handed me to open a new way of life. The next morning, Amy and I, along with the new management team, hosted a small event right outside the main lobby, where the Mitchell Sons sign had stood for 34 years. The new sign was ready, draped in white fabric. I stepped out into the gentle early winter sunlight, microphone in hand, before hundreds of employees, shareholders, partners, and those who had accompanied me on this journey. Every gaze was filled with questions, not about what was coming next, but why I was changing the company's name. "I know some of you might wonder," I began slowly, "why change a name that has been tied to our family's history for nearly 4 decades? I glanced up at the top floor where sunlight streamed through the large glass windows. But the truth is, Mitchell Sons never really included me. Even though I was here, learned here, grew up among every piece of wood, every blueprint. That name is my father's legacy, but there was never a place for his daughter in the old structure." I paused for a moment. Today, I'm not erasing that legacy. I'm expanding it. I'm adding the forgotten part. I'm adding myself. I nodded slightly. Soft music played quietly from the speakers. At the same time, 2 employees pulled down the white fabric. On the new sign, the letters shone clearly in the sunlight. D. Mitchell Foundation Company. Beneath it was a simple slogan: building more than windows. A round of applause erupted. Not the clapping of a formal ceremony, but the sincere sound of people who had witnessed transformation. I didn't need to say more. The company name now spoke for itself. That evening, I was invited as the keynote speaker at a business and community responsibility conference in Houston. The topic was Legacy and Redefining Power in the Family. I walked onto the stage without notes. I used to think I was an outsider, I began, soft lights casting over the packed auditorium. The daughter who wasn't to inherit. The wife who had to be silent to preserve a company's existence. The shadow of a man who never saw me as a partner. I lifted my head, eyes scanning the rows. But I was wrong. I wasn't outside. I was stepping back to take a run. And when I returned, I didn't just reclaim the company, I reclaimed myself. The room fell silent, so quiet you could hear pens scratching and soft sighs from somewhere below. If you've ever been forced to sacrifice yourself, whether in marriage, work, or silence, remember, you have the right to live your own life. You don't need permission to step into the light. And you absolutely can take back everything. Rightfully. Proudly. And in a way that makes them remember you forever. I didn't need applause. I only needed that silence. The way someone bowed their head and placed a hand over their heart, as if seeing themselves in the story I just told. Because if I could stand up, so could they. If I could turn a manipulated marriage into a career rebuilding a life, then anyone can begin again no matter how late. I know my father will never hear these words. But I believe he's somewhere up there on a high floor, beside the oak window frame he once installed with his own hands in his first office, smiling. Not because I succeeded, but because I finally walked on my own 2 feet. I'm not telling this story to paint myself as a hero, but to remind us all of something many of us forget. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up against others. It's daring to stand up for yourself. Have you ever had to sacrifice who you are to keep a family, a relationship, or something you thought was irreplaceable? Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up? So I want to hear your story. Please share your thoughts below, because maybe your experience will give courage to someone silently suffering just as I once did. And if you believe everyone has the right to redefine their life, no matter how late, please subscribe to follow more honest, turbulent, yet hopeful stories about family loss and the journey back to ourselves. Because sometimes the things that seem broken are just waiting to be restarted by hands brave enough to seize the chance.